Welcome everyone to this session indeed organized by the group that I have still the privilege to chair for the next few months before ceding it to someone else for the next term. We are going to speak about the I word, investment. Well, what is investment? That means harnessing and engaging means, well, financial, human, material means with the hope, it's a hope, it's not a certainty, otherwise you're not an investor, with the hope of achieving future benefits. That is what we are talking about. And of course, the first prerequisite for investing is an act of faith. That is believing in your future. If you don't believe in your future, you don't invest. And indeed, we hear a lot about investment. We hear even more about investors, and usually in the financial sense of the term. But actually, what we have a lot is, rather than investment and investors, what we witness is more rent extraction and rent seekers. That is, people who claim to be investors, but actually they want the certainty of returns, outsourcing the risk to their workers, to the consumers, to the taxpayer, to nature. That's the opposite of what we want. And actually, we believe in our future. And in order to build it, well, we will need to invest, and that is what we are going to discuss today. So we are going to have 2 speakers online and 4 speakers here in the room, and we have time enough. I think that all our speakers have a talent for being straight to the point. We will have time enough to have an exchange between the speakers and with the room. And so without further ado, I will introduce you the speakers later on, but I will invite Guillaume Kerlero, Esther Lynch, Jean Pisani-Ferry, and Kira Peter-Hansen to join me on the stage so that we can start. Welcome and thank you for being here online. Online, we will have someone from heavy industry, and we are going to have another economist. So, who am I missing? Jean. Bienvenue. Jean just arrived from Paris. I understand there were some problems with the railways, but he's doing us the favor of being with us today. So, as I told you, we are going to run through a story, and the basic of the base element of the story is sizing how much investment we need. So yes, we will focus on the financial part of investment, but it is of course crucial. It's money, le nerf de la guerre, as we say in French. And we, the Greens, have commissioned an in-depth study by a French think tank called Institut Rousseau, based in Paris, who had actually astonished us by studying what extra investments, compared to business as usual, would be needed for France to meet the climate neutrality target in 2050. And we felt how great it would be to have that for the entire European Union. So, Jean, you will tell me later that, well, some others had similar ideas. So I think that in a space of a few months, we are going to have a few studies coming out telling us exactly what the investment gap is. But so I will first ask Guillaume to explain us, well, how much are we talking about and how is it distributed across sectors and countries. So you may speak from the lectern or from your place, as you wish.
As you prefer. Well, I'm well here. Thanks. No, okay, I'm going. Can you hear me? Yeah. So thanks, Philippe. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here and to have the opportunity to show you the results of this groundbreaking study that became reality thanks to your support and to discuss it with my co-panelists. So this study involved more than 150 experts and researchers across Europe from many disciplines, and it comes with a level of details that we think was never achieved before, and describes the real economy with a bottom-up approach based on real-life physics. How many buildings do we need to renovate? How many train lines? How many hectares you need to convert to organic and agroecological practices, etc. So let's get to it. You already know it. If we follow the current business-as-usual trend, we won't meet our climate targets. But where do these current emissions come from? Here you have the results. So you know that on the left-hand side, you can see that the EU GHG emissions are mostly based on energy production, 26%, then transport and industry, around 22-23%, and then agriculture and buildings with approximately 13% each. On the right-hand side, you can see that these emissions can vary significantly from one country to another, both in total volume, but also in proportion among the different sectors. It means that even if the general cocktail of solutions is the same everywhere, national economic action plans need to be tailor-made and adapted to the local context. So, next slide. This is the general cocktail I was talking about. It's too tiny for you to read, I know that. I'm not here to detail everything. You already know what needs to be done in most sectors. We need to renovate our buildings. We need to improve energy efficiency and material efficiency in the industry. We need to develop soft mobility, public transportation, and convert the remaining vehicles to low-carbon technologies, and so on. My point here is that there is no silver bullet. There is no magic trick that makes that will reduce all emissions in the economy at once. All these levers, regardless of scale, of economical efficiency, must be engaged to reduce our emissions and reach our targets. So now we're here for that. Let's talk about money and how much does it cost to buy and drink this cocktail. The answer is 40 trillion euros by 2050 in total, which means basically 1,500 billion per year, which is more or less 9 to 10 points of GDP. The good news is that 3/4 of these investments are already planned and must be redirected. So we need a massive divestment from obsolete to harmful activities and shift them toward the transition. For instance, the money we put today in diesel cars must be put into public transportation, biking infrastructures, and low-carbon vehicles, for instance. The investment gap is around, so 1/4, which is 10 trillion in total, which means 360 billion per year. Okay, this is something around 2.3 points of GDP, and it's a 30% increase compared to the baseline scenario. Just to put this in perspective, because maybe you don't see what 360 billion means, it's half of what the EU spent in 2022 on fossil fuel imports. So now you tell me, what is currently making us waste money? Is it investing in the ecological transition, or is it liberal policies and lack of planification? When you look at how this spreads among sectors, you can see that 3/4 are concentrated in transport, almost half of the total investment, and buildings. This is because of the very large-scale nature of these sectors, involving investments in tens of millions of vehicles and buildings. Then you have energy, 12%, and agriculture, 10%. When then you consider the extra investment, you can see that the top 4 sectors remain the same, but their ranking change. And it's the building and energy production sectors that necessitate the most substantial extra effort. In the building sector, it's because we are not doing things properly right now, and we need to accelerate the renovation pace and shift towards more comprehensive renovation. And on the energy side, It's because we need to electrify all end uses we can, because it's easier to decarbonize, and develop also power to gas, which leads to an increase of plus 70% in electricity consumption, at least, more if we don't have sufficiency as a North Star. When you look at the different countries, so we get results not only at the EU scale, but also for 7 major economies, representing something around 75% of the EU GDP and emissions. You can see that it's quite variable from one country to another, and the 2.3% of GDP that I gave you as an average goes from 1.4 in Germany to 3.6 in Poland. I won't detail the reasons why right now, and get directly to the public share of this investment. My key message here is that it's mainly to the public authorities to do the job, or at least their role is absolutely key for 2 reasons. First, because it's the public sector, through regulation or incentives, or mix of both, to make sure that all these public and private business as usual investment are shifted towards the transition. Second, because most of the extra investment needed, that's what you have on the right-hand side, 70% of it must come from the public sector. Why is that? Again, 2 reasons. First, because there are investments that are significant, that are under the scope of the public sector, like renovating public buildings or developing collective transports, but also because there are investments that are not profitable enough and that the private sector will not make by itself. The invisible hand of the market here won't do the job alone. We would do it by now, I think. This is the case in the building sector. This is the case in the heavy industry sector. Maybe Winston will agree and tell us more about it. And of course, it's true in the agricultural sector. I let you link this to the agricultural crisis occurring right now. Again, it's very variable from a sector from a country to another. I'll skip this and skip to something that is very important, I think, is to contextualize these 260 extra public money. This graph shows that it's less than what we spent on COVID. It's 100 billion less than what we are currently spending per year on fossil fuel subsidies, including energy shields. And if you want to compare it to another positive investment that we do in our future, it's 2.5 less than what we invest currently in education. In the short term, member states will need financial margins to act, and we can talk about this later, but including about the European fiscal rule currently under negotiation. One last slide to tell you that this investment plan is not only necessary, it's desirable. Of course, from an ecological point of view, of course, from a social point of view, but also from a purely economical point of view. Doing that will improve our trade balance by several hundred thousand of euros per year. Last year, we spent 650 on fossil fuel imports, as I said. Will improve our geopolitical sovereignty and economical resilience, will create hundreds of thousands of jobs. It's estimated, we are currently doing another study to dig into this, but just for France, we know it's between 300,000 and 1 million net new jobs to be created. And of course, we'll save future public money. It's not only about spending, it's really about saving on one side and redirecting it, and also investing in the future with some returns on investment, if I may say, and something that will lower the pressure on future public budgets, for instance, by reducing climate change adaptation costs or unemployment insurances. And to finish with, we'll also increase the short-term public purchasing power of many Europeans. All these wins will be all the more true that we produce locally and that will reduce our consumption. And this is another key takeaway from our work. Sufficiency measures are not an option. Electrification without reducing demand is not only more costly, it's also, it poses higher risks to energy sovereignty and is faced with both resource constraints and industrial deployment bottleneck. Around the 70 policy proposal that there is in this report, and that you can use for the European campaign, of course. A lot are based on an analysis of best practices from best-in-class countries, which shows that what we propose is not crazy, it's usually already existing and working somewhere, showing that all this plan is not only for dreamers, but for doers. My conclusion, we face a quite straightforward choice here. We can miss our transition target and pave the way for a very uncertain, surely dark future. We will keep spending twice the required transition money on fossil fuel imports, or we can be responsible planners, create hundreds of thousands of local jobs, improve our sovereignty and trade balance, stimulate the economy, and improve Europeans' life. Thank you.
Thank you, Guillaume. Thank you very much. And of course, there's a lot of work behind all these figures. So we need to invest an extra 360 billion a year, which is not an absurdly high number. Your last slide showed the benefits. Investing is in favor of future benefits. And we could also understand that non-investment, non-action would be costly as well. So indeed, it seems to be a business case. And before asking my invitees who are economists, I wanted to speak with the social partners. And first, I have asked someone from heavy industry. His name is Winston Beck. He's not with us physically. He's calling in from Brussels. Welcome, Mr. Beck. And guess what? This is not renewable energy. This is cement. Heidelberger, it's now Heidelberger Materials. It's heavy industry. I thought also about steel. Why is that? Well, because these industries are making stuff that actually we need. And this is stuff that is really hard to decarbonize. This is not easy, really not easy. And the question I want to ask you, Mr. Beck, is, well, a significant chunk of these 360 billion have to come from the private sector. Can we count on you guys to invest? And is it imaginable that the private sector, given, of course, the regulatory incentives or obligations to do so, is it thinkable that the private sector can do everything on its own? Or do we need some form of partnership between the private sector and the public sector? So the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Philippe. I hope you can see me and hear me.
Absolutely.
Well, very good. So first of all, thanks very much for the invitation, and apologies I didn't make it to Lyon in person. I would have loved to be there. So I'm representing Heidelberg Materials. We are one of the world's largest construction material companies, and we are also the largest cement producer in Europe. So exactly as you said, Philippe, we are a heavy industry and we are considered hard to abate. So I'm very pleased to be here because we know that these are difficult economic times, also for the construction industry. And I believe that even more so that we have a common interest to make the Green Deal also an industrial success story. And first of all, I want to tell you a bit about ourselves, and then I will respond to the questions about how to finance the transition. So Heidelberg Materials, we take our responsibility very serious. I don't know if you know that, but concrete is the second most used material in the world after water. It's used in buildings, it's used in infrastructure, but it's also essential for the green transition. I mean, if you think about a windmill, each windmill uses more than 80 tons of concrete for the fundament. If you think about a hydropower station, for example, so it really provides, I think, real value to society. At the same time, it's also very clear that it's emission and energy intensive. So we need to change the production process, which has been around for many years. But it also provides a great lever, right? If we decarbonize the point sources, we can really make huge gaps in the huge leaps in the emission reductions. So at Heidelberg, we have decided that we want to reduce our global emissions by almost 50% by 2030 compared to 1990. And of course, we want to provide all our customers with net zero products, latest by 2050. That's the most ambitious targets in our industry. And of course, in Europe, things can move even faster if we decide on the right regulations and if we make the right decisions also from the financial point of view. We mainly have three levers to decarbonize our business. The first one is that we need to replace fossil energy sources, mainly with alternative fuels and renewables in our case. We need to apply a circular mindset. We are already using byproducts and waste from other industries to reduce the clinker, which is the CO2 heavy part in our production. And of course, we are also looking into recycling for concrete. Concrete is, in theory, 100% recyclable, but we need to get access to the material. And last but not least, we also need carbon capture, storage and utilization. And you saw that on the slide of our previous speaker, because 2/3 of our emissions are process emissions coming from the heating up of our main raw material, limestone. And for that, CCUS is currently the only technologies to get us to net zero. So CCUS is also really becoming an industrial location factor, I would say. And that is the reason why we have already announced 9 major CCS projects around the globe. And the first CCS facility in cement will go live at our plant in Norway, in Brevik, at the end of this year. And we will start capturing and storing 400,000 tons of CO2. So we have a clear roadmap, which you can also read on our website. We are quite confident that we have the know-how and also a majority of the technologies to implement it. But what we are indeed lacking is the business case to also make it work commercially. And I think, Philippe, you put it right. We do need the business case to also make our investors believe in our future. The problem is that these large-scale decarbonization projects are very capital intensive with much higher operational costs. So we are talking here about investments of 350 to 500 million euros per plant, plus a doubling or even more of the operational costs. And think that we have around 200 cement plants in Europe alone. Carbon pricing, what we have in the EU, so the ETS, certainly helps because it provides us with some long-term predictability. But it's not sufficient, especially not if you look at the carbon price at the moment of 63 euros per ton CO2. That may change in the medium term, but we do need to build bridges until then. So we do need incentives and we do need fundings, and it's quite clear what also my previous speaker has said, that this partly needs to come from public sources, because as I said, we otherwise cannot make a business case for the time being. We have certain instruments in place, right? I mean, we have the EU ETS Innovation Fund, which is good, but it's focused only on innovation, and it's not fit for purpose when we talk about large-scale deployment. You know that the Innovation Fund is oversubscribed 10 to 20 times every year, which shows that we have very good projects in place, but we cannot implement them for the time being. And that's one of the reasons why we advocate for a clean tech deployment fund for the next EU legislative term, which could also be financed partly out of the EU ETS revenues. If you look at the ETS revenues, 85% is going to the member states. A lot of that is not used for climate-related projects, and even if it's used for climate-related projects, these are not usually part of the hard-to-abate industries. But one more point I need to make is that we are, of course, also only a part of the entire value chain, right? So we need to make sure that we foster the right ecosystem, and it's very clear that our system becomes increasingly complex, and so do our products. And what is absolutely key is that we have an urgent rollout of renewable energies, and that we also implement the CO2 infrastructure, which we need to decarbonize our plants. And when we talk about energy, I mean, also consider the trade-offs. When we decarbonize one of our plants, we estimate that our electricity consumption will double or even triple. And of course, this extra power needs to come from renewables. And lastly, we also need to think about the supply side. We already have low carbon products in place. 60% reduced CO2, for example, for our Ecocrete in Germany. But these are so far only niche markets. So we really need to create elite markets, and we need to update the procurement rules. And also here, the public sector really has a big role. 40 to 50% of all the concrete is sold to public projects. But so far, if you look at the tender, the main criteria is always the price.
Indeed, thank you, Winston. So I take it that indeed, when we speak about the economic transition, we are not just speaking about new industries, but about the greening of existing industries that will be part of our future regardless. And no, the dream of the Greens is not an industry-less Europe. This is not what we want. But what we want is that our industry is really leading the way into the 21st century. So thank you. And we understand that indeed, public money will be needed, especially, I would say, in heavy industry, where the capital expenditures of, I would say, initial or pilot projects will be really high, and where basically risk needs to be shared between the public and the private sector. But thank you for your contribution. And then, having heard an employer, I want to turn to Esther. Esther Lynch is Confederal Secretary of the European Trade Unions Confederation. We go back quite a long time, Esther. I think gone are the days where the Greens and the trade unions were looking at each other in a suspicious way, thinking, well, you know, these trade unions, they just cling to the past, and then all these Greens have no clue about quality jobs and employment. These days are long over. We have been fighting together for a long time, and we know that the trade unions are now totally behind the European Green Deal, but not under any conditions. So, Esther, you have the floor.
Thanks so much for the invitation, and indeed, thanks so much for the great cooperation with the European Greens, but also with you, Philippe, in relation to the economic governance rules. And I promise I'll get to that, but really just to thank the European Greens for inviting the European trade union movement to be part of this discussion this afternoon. As you know, we represent 54 million workers and their trade unions from throughout Europe. And I want to pick up the ball that was bounced at the very end there, which was about public procurement rules. And that's the type of leadership that we need from business at the moment. We need business to be fully behind decarbonising without deindustrialising. We do not need a narrative which is, well, we can't afford it now, let's get rid of all these red tape regulations. Nothing could be farther from the truth from what's needed. It's a misleading discussion to say you can have one or the other. It's misleading people to say, well, you can either have a job or you can have a green policy. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, we're working together with the Green group in the European Union to put forward a green industrial policy. And we have 5 elements to that green industrial policy. The first of those is to have an ambitious legislative workers' rights agenda. Because I don't know about you, but I'm really sick of hearing people say, leave no one behind. But everybody I'm meeting, there's a lot of people being left behind. And even the OECD's research is showing that workers, 50% of workers are fearful that they will in fact be left behind if their job closes down. So we need to get underneath that and to give confidence. We need to be very clear with working people what's required of them to succeed, but also what supports are with them to help them succeed. And that absolutely must include a right to training, a right to union bargaining for a fair transition and investment in them, but also that redundancy is not the first option. But also we need a lot more joined up thinking. I was looking recently at the struggle because there's still millions of people who can't find jobs in the European Union. And we're looking at what are the demands that employers have for workers to be able to even apply for a job. And do you know what is one of the main criteria that employers have? That you have to have a car. Now, that is a policy. It's just an automatic requirement that's on a job list. It's directly opposite of what we want to achieve, which is employers who are focused on enabling workers to use public transport, making sure that their start and finish times fully supports that, investing in them to be able to use that, not having as an automatic requirement where you have to have a car. The second ambition that we have is to have sufficient funding for the just transition. And this is where we are becoming increasingly fearful. Because not only if the economic governance rules are adopted as they currently are, not only will there not be money for investment, but there will need to be cuts as well. Make no mistake about it. So the work that you're doing to counteract those rules, to change those rules, is incredibly important for all of us. When there is investment, that investment can no longer be with a blank check. Can't be the case that we give companies money and say, well, we trust you to do the right thing with it. We trust that when you make that when you start making profits, you'll invest in the workforce. That you'll pay a decent wage, both to your direct workers and also in the supply chain. No, we need to say, yes, there's investment, but that investment comes with social conditionalities attached. We need to make sure that throughout the supply chain that there are decent working conditions, that there are investment in workers to be able to learn the new skills, that there's apprenticeships, that the purchasing, not just the production, but also the purchasing is green and social. And we can do that. And we should set that as an ambition for the next 4 years. By the time we get to Denmark, we need to have a legislative proposal that will guarantee that Denmark, as you know, will have the presidency of the European Union. And that's a great and real ambition that we can all work towards. I really want to thank all of you, in particular under Philippe's leadership, what is trying to be done for the European governance rules to make them fair. But also we need to look at the interest rates. Interest rates are very much part of the story as to the challenges that both workers are facing in the cost of living crisis, but also companies are facing in terms of their current and future success. And taxes. We need to make sure that taxes are fair. Taxes aren't the only part of the story, but they are a very important part of the story. We know that there's a social justice emergency in Europe. We know that too much is being asked of working people. We need to change that. We need to make it very clear that those who have the most are being asked for more, that they're being asked to pay their fair share, to do their part of the heavy lifting. Finally, then, to say that all of this can be achieved. I know that we're speaking to working people who are beginning to give up hope, who are beginning to get discouraged. I know there's nobody here who feels discouraged. I know that all of you are encouraged for the future. And I encourage you to work with trade unions so that we can have workplace discussions, to work with trade unions, whether it's with our sector colleagues. I know that IFAT are here, I know that the building and woodworkers, to have those discussions specifically, to work with the ETUC, to work together with other progressive parties, because that's how we're going to win in the next 4 years. Compromise, discussion, cooperation, making sure to put the needs of working people and the green agenda on the table at the same time in a way that everybody can succeed and move forward. Thank you, Philippe.
Thank you, Esther, and again, thank you for the great cooperation that we are having. I remember when I joined the Parliament 15 years ago, things were different, and frankly, I think that we have a stellar cooperation at the moment. So we established that there's a significant need for investment for the next quarter century. This is a long-haul project. I understand if I speak with the social partners, both on the employer side as on the worker side, there's a willingness to go there, to enter there. So the question is, how do we manage? And there I have asked two economists to come and speak with us. First is Jean Pisani-Ferry. Jean was, for a moment, the head of Bruegel, one of the best loved think tanks in Brussels, at least loved by the European Commission, certainly. I think the first time we met Jean was during my first term in a small room with Pascal Canfin, if I remember well, and then Guillaume. We were the trio of the Greens in the Econ Committee in the European Parliament. And Jean has always impressed me because he's one of those economists who have 2 feet in the ground. Of course, one can always be carried away by economic theory, but what strikes me is that Jean tries to work about the world we're in. And that is impressive. Jean, you have been writing also Emmanuel Macron's program years ago, yet Jean is someone who engages with people who really want to make stuff move. And this is why he accepted to come here. Jean, you published a study with, what's her name again? Selma Mahfouz. Great study, well, targeted on France as to how, well, what the transition means economically. You are going to share with us the gist, and the key question I have for you is how can we fund this? Because frankly speaking, there's one thing that I think we all agree here, not necessarily outside. Some say, yeah, but you know, this is so expensive we can't afford it. It's as if we would say, well, actually we can't afford to keep living conditions on this planet good for human beings. It's as if, okay, we can't afford to live further. And just imagine, I mean, with that kind of reasoning, another Winston, not Beck, but Churchill would have said, okay, let's seek an armistice with the Nazis because, well, we can't afford to continue the fight. When it's vital, we have to do it. The question is how. Jean, you have the floor.
Thank you, Philippe, and it's really good to be here, and congratulations for the type of debate you're organizing, you know, with the trade unions, with employers. I mean, we've got to be concrete. We've got to be, you know, it's getting real, and I think the message from you and from this meeting is that it's getting real. Now. I also welcome the evaluation by the Institute Rousseau that Guillaume presented because what we did with Selma was to sort of, you know, a bit the same type of exercise. We looked at the numbers, we looked at how much investment needs to be done, and all that needs to be extremely concrete in order to come to an assessment that tells you something. Because you need to look at, you know, how many gas boilers do we have, how many fuel boilers do we have, what the cost of changing them, etc. And that by, you know, doing this kind of bean counting exercise, that you come to numbers that corresponds to something, and also that can facilitate the exchange communication with concrete people, with real people, I mean, in charge of certain sectors. So I'm not shocked by your overall figure. I think that's, you know, in the ballpark of what was our assessment in the case of France, what other assessment are. For example, the UK assessment is very much similar. I'm a bit surprised by the share of the public sector. I think it's on the high side. So perhaps we can discuss why 70%. I think there are many reasons why there needs to be, you know, it cannot be done without a significant input from the public sector. Because, as you said, you know, there are public buildings and you've got to renovate the public buildings because they are private enterprises for which the investment is simply not economically sensible without a contribution from the public side. So all that is understandable, and there are also people who cannot simply pay by themselves for the investment. If you're speaking of the cost of renovating houses, the cost of changing vehicle, for the middle class, it's a very high cost. I mean, those costs are in France of the order of magnitude of 1 year of income for both costs. So those are really significant costs, and people cannot afford them, and they're not going to go into credit and get credit for that because they're not interesting for the financial sector. So the state has to step in. Now, why is it that the cost is that high? 2.3% of GDP, that's a significant, that's a really high number. And I think the explanation is simple. It's simply that, everything you're speaking of is an investment that will eventually pay off in terms of lower operation expenditure. So lower OPEX, higher CAPEX upfront. That's the equation. So you're basically substituting fossil fuels with capital expenditure. And that requires a very high capital expenditure upfront. And down the road, the Brits have actually, done the calculation, all the calculations. They have nice curves. You see that down the road, you're saving on operation expenditure. So that's the reason why it's high. It's high, but you didn't mention adaptation. I think adaptation has to be added to that cost, so it may be still an underestimate. So how can it be financed? I think there are basically three ways of doing it if you're speaking of the public sector. One is expenditures reshuffling. So you save on brown expenditures and you allocate more to green expenditures. The problem is that this is being resisted, and we have a very good example in this country of the decision 2 days ago to not to or to discontinue the increase in the cost of gazole non routier for the peasants. So it shows that it immediately hurts, and immediately people take the street, and the government in this case went back to reneged on its commitment. So that's there are limits to that. Second, you can go into debt, and I think that shouldn't be excluded because there are many good reasons, many bad reasons for a government to go into debt. Climate is not one, for precisely the reason that I gave. That it implies investment upfront and savings down the road. Now, the case for that. Thank you. The case. Let me see if you're going to continue to applaud while if I continue. I think you have to be very disciplined in this regard. You have to be very disciplined when you're making the case for green debt, green borrowing, because there are many things you can consider as green investment, and that won't be accepted if you go that road. I think there is a very strong, narrow case for green going into debt for the financing of green investment, and we may wish to go back to that. If you even see 0.5% of GDP per year, right? That's a fraction of the public share, but that's a fraction that can be financed by debt, and that still represent over 30 years, that still represent 15 percentage point of GDP, so it's not insignificant. Finally, taxes, they're hard to avoid. When you do the equation, when you do the numbers, you end up with a gap, and this gap has to be filled by taxes. You're not going to reshuffle all the expenditures. You're not going to use debt, without limits. So you need to do that, and that requires raising taxes. So, which taxes? The reason why in our report, and let me end on that, we propose a one-off tax on the of the financial wealth of the top 10% of the population of the upper decile, is that those people, they are on the winning side of the transition, and the equity requirement in this regard is absolutely paramount. I mean, you have to. It's not the same kind of equity concept than in a normal that we use normally in assessing policies. It's something that has to be demonstrably a sharing of sacrifice. And if there is equity in the sharing of sacrifice for the transition, then it makes the transition more acceptable.
Thank you very much, Jean. And indeed, I often say that, well, we are facing, of course, deep changes, and we should not kid ourselves about that. So that means effort. But effort can be accepted on three conditions. One, that the necessity is recognized, but even when talking with farmers on Thursday before coming here, they all recognized, well, the people I talked with, that we need the transition. There's no question about that. Then the second thing is, of course, that the measures that are taken that require effort are tackling the issue. No one wants to make an effort for nothing, right? But then the third one is equity. That the broadest shoulders carry the largest part of the effort. And let's admit that when I look at the way the cost of the financial crisis has been borne, the cost of the Eurozone crisis, that cannot be said. That cannot be said, and this is a heritage, a legacy that we have to live with. So there's a big level of distrust about the willingness and the ability of policymakers to make sure that indeed contributions will be proportionate to the capacity, and that is crucial. Now, I want to turn to our second speaker who is online, Olivier Blanchard. Some of you may have heard that name. Olivier Blanchard used to be the chief economist of the International Monetary Fund. And always very interesting reading. If you read his articles, Olivier Blanchard struck me by his reflections with hindsight about how we dealt with the Eurozone crisis, and especially crisis countries such as Greece. Because he's again an economist who has his 2 feet rooted in reality. Despite you might think, okay, IMF, this is stratospheric, but I always found really in him someone who wants to think about what we are doing. And I was struck because not long ago, we heard Olivier Blanchard in the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee of the European Parliament, because we were discussing options as to what to do for the fiscal rules, the budget rules that we want to put in place at the European level. And what you said, Olivier, about indeed the debt aspect of the funding of the transition, I found very interesting. And indeed, as Jean said, there's 3 sources of financing. It's shifting spending patterns. There's increased income for governments, and that's taxes. And then there's borrowing. And you know, oftentimes when we get to speak about borrowing, in German, Schuld, that is guilt, don't do this, we can't. This is impossible. And I found that indeed IMF has been working a lot on public debt, and the analysis of the sustainability of debt. What makes debt sustainable or unsustainable? And I found that the voice of Olivier would be welcome in this circle to discuss options. What can we and cannot we do when it comes to funding the transition, especially through borrowing? Olivier, you have the floor.
Thank you, Philippe. You can hear me, I assume?
Yes, sir.
Very good. I'm going to overlap a bit with what Jean said, which is probably good news about the fact that sometimes economists agree on things. But I'll say a few different things. I'm indeed going to focus on the fiscal aspects of green spending. Let me do a bit of publicity, which is that in 10 minutes you can only kind of sketch an argument. I have a paper on the Peterson Institute site, which is much more detailed, and people who are interested should probably go there and look at it. Okay, so the starting point is exactly what you said, Philippe, which is we hear a lot of statements about the debt level being catastrophic, that just no way we can increase it, and the priority should be to decrease it. The size of the interest payments that we have to pay is gigantic. It's taking money away from very good programs which we could fund otherwise, and so on and so on. And the question is this right? And I think the answer is no, it's not. And so I basically want to take this detour and then go back to the implications for the financing of green spending. So if I had one message that I would like people to remember and convince them of, is that the problem is not really the level of debt. It is the future evolution of debt. Or put another way, you can have a high debt level, you'll get away with it, and you should, but if you have a debt level which is seen to be increasing forever relative to GDP, you're in trouble. You will not be able to borrow in any way. It's a very bad idea to do that. So let me try. I find that when I say this, people who hate debt and think debt is just a crime or a sin have a hard time understanding why I say that. So let me go through a bit of algebra, I mean informal algebra, and I apologize for the audience, but I have not found any way of doing it more simply. Suppose that we decide that we have some debt, say 100% debt to GDP, which is kind of, an average in Europe. And we decide that we're going to basically, when we need to pay the interest payments on the debt, we're going to issue new debt. We're not going to raise taxes, we're just going to issue new debt, right? So if we do this, then debt will increase at the rate of interest, which we have to pay on the debt. So it will increase at R, to use this is the algebra part. I'm using an R as a variable. Okay, now what we care about is debt in relation to GDP. And GDP is increasing over time, not every year as we know, but on average at some rate, say G. And so what's going to happen is the debt to GDP ratio, which is what in the end we want to stabilize, will change at R minus G. R because of the increase in debt, G because the denominator is increasing. And the reason I say debt is not a major issue at this point is that if you're in a world in which R is roughly equal to G, then debt to GDP will stabilize without having to raise taxes. And that's the environment we are more or less in. In the past, we were actually in an even better environment. R was less than G, so it was even nicer. But if I look now forward, it seems to me reasonable to say R and G are roughly the same values, which means that even if we just finance the interest by issuing debt, then we would stabilize the debt ratio, whatever the level. So it sounds as if it doesn't much matter. That's not a cost in terms of higher taxes or anything. Now, the reason why this is only half of the argument is that that's right if we don't issue more debt than that. And that's where the notion of what we call a primary balance or a primary deficit comes in, which is that we actually issue more debt than what I've said, more debt than that is needed to finance the interest, because we would not, if we finance all the non-interest spending by taxes, they would be fine. But typically there is a gap, right, which is known as the primary deficit. And that's the worrisome part, which is the first argument was nice, but if we have a primary deficit, then we're issuing too much more debt, and then the debt to GDP ratio would increase. So long detour, but the point in the end is what matters is at this stage the sequence of what we can expect primary deficits to be from now into the future. And a responsible fiscal policy is a policy which, if R minus G remains 0 or close to, basically gets our primary deficits from whatever they are today to 0. We have to get to 0 because that's the only way to stabilize the debt. So now let me move closer to the issues that concern you directly and concern me directly as well. But suppose there was no global warming. We didn't need to do anything on that front. Now I look at my now home country, which is France now, and I see a primary deficit of about 3%. And so a responsible policy would be to say, well, we have 3%. As long as we have 3%, debt to GDP would increase. That's not good. We have to have a plan to go from 3 to 0. Not overnight, would be crazy, but over, say, 5-10 years. And that's the first challenge that many governments face. The French government does. Now, it may be difficult to do, but it has to be done because you have to end up with 0 at the end. Now, you add on that what we have discussed in the first hour, which is, well, bad news. Not only do you have to decrease 3 to 0, but you also have to spend money in order to fight global warming. And that's the numbers that we have discussed. Now, I thought the first presentation was very good, but it did not take into account adaptation, which is going to be increasingly costly. And it didn't take account on the other side the fact that ETS bring revenues. And so my own guess, which I might revise when I look at the slides more closely of the paper, is basically that to do what we need to do for a number of years, the net additional spending that we need to do is about 0.5% of GDP. 1% on investment, and then we get 0.5% back on ETS if we expand that. Okay, so now we had to go from 3 to 0. And well, now if we want to do what is needed, we have to go from 3.5 to 0. And so the question is, what do we do? And that's where we get into the hard part. So basically, let me just make sure that I have not forgotten anything before I get there. Okay, so the first thing let's say, if I were a benevolent dictator, or if Philippe, you actually had the majority of the parliament behind you, what should you do? It seems to me it's fairly obvious that you should do the 0.5%. So on the one hand, you should try to reduce the non-global warming part of the deficit by tough measures, reforms, whatever, but you should do the 0.5%, which means that for some time the primary deficits would be higher, right? Because you just have to spend more. And, I have not talked about defense and other things which add to the bill. And yes, we would end up with more debt, probably 10 years out, 20% more debt to GDP. To me, that would be an incredibly attractive way of doing things. Yes, there would be 20% debt more, right? But I've argued it's not very costly. And we would maybe have saved the planet, God knows, right? So between the two, it seems to me it's fairly obvious. There was a cartoon, which I may have mentioned to you, Philippe, in a previous intervention, which is, it's an old man and a young man in his 2050, and the earth is destroyed. The trees don't have leaves, and we failed. But the old man says to the young man, yes, we have destroyed the planet, but debt to GDP is less than 60%. And I think it encapsulates the discussion we have, right? So it's clear that we have to be open to the idea that for good reasons, which is what Jean insisted on, there are cases where you actually don't want to just drastically reduce. So, but the point with this, now we get to very concrete stuff, the stuff that you deal with every day, is that there are now rules that the governments just agreed to. And these rules do not allow for a solution like the one I gave. Now, as you know, Philippe, I fought very hard from where I was, and you fought very hard from where you were, and many people did. But in the end, this kind of path in which you allow for some increase and then a decrease later is violating the rules. So you can do three things. The first one is, well, you just follow the rules, but the result is that you don't do what you need to do, and you probably don't do what you need to do on the green front. I suspect it has high probability. The second is that you say, the hell with the rules, and you just do what is right. Now, I think it's very difficult for countries which have just signed something to actually do that. Now, they should have known, but they did it. So I cannot see the French Minister of Finance saying, well, these rules are stupid. Oh, I signed them last week, but they're really stupid. And we're not going to satisfy them. So I don't think that's, again, open. But fortunately, and maybe I'll end with that, because that's kind of the slightly optimistic part, we have not excluded the possibility of financing through Brussels, through things like the Next Gen EU. And the rules do not talk about this. Now, it is a bit hypocritical because it is still debt. But there are many reasons to think it makes sense to do it at the Brussels level, at the EU level. It has to be, as Jean said, it can be, a commission can give its agreement to particular projects. There are externalities. There are all kinds of reasons to do it. But in the end, it's debt. It's additional debt. But at least that's still open. So if I were one of your parties, it seems to me that that's what I would be working on. The other options which I've heard, which is, let's issue green debt, I think just doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't solve anything. The notion that, if you do green stuff, you can issue it, you can finance it by debt, it's no problem, is not logical. That has to be repaid in some form at some point. So it seems to me that the conclusion is you can do it. It's not gigantic, especially if you use ETS rather than subsidies, which is what the US is doing. And it has to basically come in the form of new next-gen programs for this and for defense and for various other things. So that's where I am.
Thank you, Olivier. And well, I would like to have that kind of conversation within the European Parliament with people who A, understand something about the economy, and B, are non-ideological about it. Now, to be honest, indeed, the discussion that we are having on fiscal rules is catastrophic. The member states have agreed on a set of rules that indeed make what needs to be done impossible, but frankly, the Parliament is has adopted a position that is not much better, and the negotiations are underway. I'm part of them, and it's appalling. I won't tell you how it works, but basically, these people are totally out of touch with reality. And Olivier, yes, of course, we could compensate for that by saying, okay, let's make all these investments at EU level. First, I see a problem, I wouldn't say of subsidiarity, but centrally driving such a massive program seems unlikely to me. My guts tell me half of these extra investments should be done at EU level, half of them at member state level. But anyway, and that's the other part of the answer, is it's exactly the same people who insist on adopting economically inept rules that say Next Gen EU, that was a once in a lifetime thing that will not come back. And we are having discussions at the European level at the moment to have an extra, cling to your seats, 20 billion until the end of the MFF, the current budgetary period, from now to 2027. And the member states don't want the European Union to have those extra 20 billion. That gives you a bit the spirit. And indeed, to me, it's like the EU leaders are sleepwalking into making themselves important in front of the the challenges that we need to face. But at least here we tried to talk sense. Kira Peter-Hansen is my colleague in the European Parliament. She's one of the leading voices of the Greens in the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee. Kira, what do you make of all this before we get to a debate with the floor?
Well, there's a lot to take from this. I think there's both the economic aspect and the theoretical. Then there's the issue of how to include the social partners and the workers. So I think starting a bit from where Olivier and you took off, Philippe, on the rules. I think maybe sometimes we think this is only an issue in the southern parts of Europe where you've experienced austerity very much. And I think it's also harder there. But even in a country like Denmark, these rule means that we can't invest in energy efficiency. So it's really some stupid rules. One of the aspects we tried to push from the green side was to include a green golden rule, saying that if you make these long-term investments, they are not counted in the debt level. So I think that is one of the ways to go forward. And then I work also very much on the banking side, and then this links to the investment. Because what we still see, and I think this is just also a bit irrational, is that it's very difficult to find private investments and to go abroad your own member state. So if you're, maybe not in Germany, but if you are a Swedish company investing and innovating the green clean tech, it's very difficult to find investors from other European countries. So there's just also some very low-hanging fruits that we can use in order to enhance the investments, and as well calculating investments or in fossil fuels as a risk for banks. I think that is also very crucial and points to what our colleague from the heavy industry was saying, that we need the incentives also, and this includes the banks, to value in when you have fossil fuel-based activities as a higher risk. And then I want to look a bit on the positive side as well. I think the Next Generation EU and the Recovery and Resilience Facility was a big step. It showed that Europe can actually do EU-funded projects and can take on the responsibility as a bloc and not only as individual member states. I think it will come again, but I think you're right, Philippe, that it's very difficult and we face a lot of opposition. And then I think I want to end with the social parts, because I think that's a very centerpiece of this. One of the things we need to work on, and also from the green side to foster this, is to strengthen the social dialogue on a European level. Right now, you and your counterparts in Business Europe are discussing several things. You can say more about how it's going, but I think also as legislators, we need to be able to include the social partners more when it comes to the whole process of reskilling and upskilling. Like, it's fine for Philippe and me to say how it should be done, but the social partners are the real experts on it. So there's some structural elements also in how we make European legislation when it comes to industry policy that we need to look on. But I think I will leave it for this, and then we can start the discussion with the audience.
Sure. Thank you, Kira. Now, I will turn to the floor. We're doing well timing-wise, so I'm happy. There are two microphones in both aisles. If you want to ask a question, you're welcome. I have a tradition that I alternate between women and men, and that means that the first one, when I do sessions, is always a woman. So, ladies, feel free. Yeah, Monica.
Hey, everyone. I have a question. You said it yourself.
I was looking. Yeah, but that's okay. Go ahead.
Right. Okay. My question relates to the fact that, you said it yourself, the negotiations with all other parties is really difficult on this topic. To a certain extent, it's about them, not losing face in front of the electorate. Also, the acceptance in the population in the countries. And my question is about how do we turn this message into a positive message, both for our competitors on the political field, but also for people who are investors. How do we tell the story in a positive way? How could you summarize that, please?
Well, maybe the question is a political one. So maybe what I want to say is that when I talk with investors, actually, they are not worried about the quantum of the debt in Europe. They are worried about a lack of economic vision and plan in Europe. So indeed, well, when we come with a plan, with a vision that can be financed, that we are not talking absurdly high figures, then we are indeed credible. And indeed, what I heard from all the speakers here was rather a positive story. It's basically, yes, we can. Okay, it's effort. We should not kid ourselves, because this is a massive transformation. And that's what I say to voters. I mean, don't expect, and they wouldn't believe me if I said otherwise, that this is going to be an easy transition. But the good news is that we can. And indeed, towards our competitors, to me, it's about having a responsible attitude towards the future and having an attitude that makes economic sense. And sorry, indeed, Olivier was saying that at the end of his speech, it is not a cartoon. I have lived that exchange. I mean, I have colleagues, in this case it was a European People's Party colleagues saying, well, you know, fighting climate change, yes, we need to do this, but it cannot be at the cost of bequeathing to the next generations a pile of debt. So yes, we will bequeath them a balanced budget, and if we need to let climate change run away, fine by me. This is reality, and this is nonsense. I mean, the talk is real, and this is nonsense. And so we have to feel confident enough, and this is what this session is about, make no mistake about this. We all need to be able to go out and make the pitch, be it to company owners or entrepreneurs, to trade unionists, to citizens who are worried, because you know the Greens don't know anything about the economy. We should feel confident, and this is the purpose of this session. Making all of you confident that we are not talking nonsense, they are talking nonsense. We tried to talk sense, and there's urgency. So I would urge us to be confident. Maybe, Kira, you want to add something on this? Okay. Next one, then.
Thank you. First of all, I love the discussion, it's very interesting. I wanted to say, of course, when we talk about financing through debt, that also means that we not only look at investors, but also at financial markets. And when we saw Southern European countries with increasing debt, they faced interest rates that were disproportionately high to the risk premium that you would have expected because of essentially market sentiment in financial markets. And so I guess my question would be, what could we do to avoid that if we were to finance the investment gap through debt?
You're speaking of the countries in the south of not the south of Europe, the global south, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right to raise this point, because we know that, you know, the EU, the US, China, they're going different ways, but they're going the same direction, at least under Biden. The countries in the south, they're facing massive challenges, and they may not have the means to pay for their investment. And if they don't do it, if they continue piling up brown, coal-fired power plants, etc., then we're not going to solve the problem. So the solution to the problem has a key global dimension. So what needs to be done is to sort of find a combination of instruments that will help those countries address their problems. In part, it's they're paying more because they're less credible domestically. In part, they're paying more because the markets do not know them well enough. In part, they're paying more because projects are inherently more risky. And there needs to be a sort of combination of instruments that addresses that. We're not going to pay it for them, but we have a clear responsibility, and this is, this has a public finance dimension, so perhaps it adds also to what we were saying before. It needs to be tackled, absolutely.
Can I also ask Olivier maybe to come in on this? And I would combine the question with something about our domestic borrowing. So you made the case that indeed, part of these investments can be funded by extra debt. But the debt to GDP ratio of Japan is 263%, I think, compared to the 90% in Europe. Some people are saying that basically when you borrow directly from your own citizens, you are in a less risky position than borrowing from the financial markets that were just referred to. Is this a fair point that we can make? Belgium sold debt to its citizens last September, and they collected 20 billion in 2 weeks at a reasonably low interest rate. So is this one of the elements that makes debt more sustainable when basically you borrow domestically?
I think the answer is yes. Let me just answer your question and the others as well. And again, probably overlapping with Jean quite a bit. It's true that there are different spreads in different countries, and they reflect bad past behavior. Maybe some cliché views of the South by the North, but partly justified by the behavior of the South in the past. So those countries clearly have to have very coherent, credible plans. And that's what we're discussing, right? I mean, they have to show that they want to do what's right, and at the same time, they basically will stabilize that. And that's harder for them. There's just no question. As Jean said, it may be that some countries cannot really do it on their own. There has to be transfers. That's part of the solution. And then the third is that clearly it can be partly done better by doing it at the EU level with joint liability. So I think it's a combination. On the domestic versus foreign investors, yes. Domestic investors are much less sensitive, much more sticky in their portfolio. So if they are the ones holding the debt, you're in less trouble. In countries in which it's mostly foreign investors, not so much to the EU, but if you go outside to the emerging markets, they can change their mind overnight and just take the money. And so in this case, you have to be even more credible, and then you have to have liquidity lines. But credibility is the issue. So I think all we're discussing here is there a credible way of doing both what's needed on the green side and not letting the debt explode. And that's harder, surely, for Italy or for France than it is, say, for Germany.
Thank you. Next question. Yes.
Hello, my name is Monica Frassoni. I would like to say that I was also a bit surprised and a little bit worried of the amount of public investment that is described in the paper. Above all, when I heard what the gentleman from Heidelberg said, because I believe that one of the most worrying or the most difficult situations in terms of filling the investment gap is the competition for resources. And we have seen in the last few years or months that the technologies, let's say, that are competing because they are calling themselves green are increasing. And the fact that CCS, for example, CCS who is entering very much and very heavily into the picture is, of course, reducing the space for renewables and for energy efficiency. And this is, I think, something that is worrying, and I would like to know how realistic it is, for example, that technologies like these can actually be an answer or a quick answer for the transition. And I am all in favor of having a lot of discussions with energy-intensive industries, but I believe that this is a real point, a real issue that is there now and was not there before. Then I also have another point that for me is a real question mark. I understand, and Philippe said it, that in the European debate, the fact of having a new next generation EU is going to be very difficult. But I do believe that what happened in Germany with the court decision is exactly a demonstration of how stupid this thing is and how ideological the fact of obliging a whole country to have a parity of budget is so completely detrimental, exactly to go in the direction of the reasoning that you were doing. Because if you are obliged to have a net zero, then of course you are not going to be able to make investment. And I wonder if in the German debate or in general in the European debate, this kind of issues are discussed, because they are really, constituent of the future that we would like to build. So these are the 2 points that for me are really important. The competition for resources, because if you get more and more technologies, then you have less and less possibility of investing, and how much of this private resources you can drag in, above all considering that, as also somebody said, there is an extremely big resistance to this reshuffling of expenditure. Thank you.
Thank you. Who wants to take this one? Well, these ones. There are two different questions. So the possible crowding out of investments by one technology kicking out the other, that's one question. And the other one is about, and there we will have a German voice at the end. It would be interesting, Alexandra, if you can say something in your conclusions later. Maybe we can park that one until you come to the floor. But about the risk of basically not having a wide enough or deep enough pool of financial resources to do it all. Because indeed, well, you spoke about CCS, carbon capture and storage. This is a technology that you can't do without in some heavy industries, yet is awfully expensive. Is there a risk there of crowding out? I don't know who can take this one.
Yeah, let me address the broader point of technology and whether technology is part of the solution. I think when and I know there's often among the Greens a sort of distrust of technology because for the obvious reason that your opponents often say, "Oh, technology is the solution. Technology will solve the problem." And now and you sort of take the opposite stance. And I think that's only partially correct. It's true that the idea, the geoengineering, I mean, it's sort of frightening, right? When you hear about changing the way the filtration of the solar radiation and so to recreate the atmosphere we had in the past, I'm frightened. But when you look at the progress that has been made in the field of renewables, it's astonishing. I mean, the International Energy Agency looks in each of its reports about what were the forecasts made in the previous reports, and each time the forecast is essentially is beaten. Yeah, for solar panels, for wind, for EVs, and I think that's really good news, and that means that at some point those technology will be, or some of them are already economically profitable with the current prices. So I think that's good. Now for CCS, I think, as was said earlier, there are some sectors in which you don't have a technology that lets you achieve the decarbonization without the CCS, and I think those CCS should be reserved or at least in priority use for in this case. Yeah.
Kira, you wanted to add something, and I see Mr. Beck wants to come in as well, and Guillaume as well. So apparently these questions raise quite a lot of attention. Kira.
Yes, and I understood also the question a bit as a worry of whether the member states would have the public resources to fund the investment. And I think there it's important for us, and unless the 4 different male economists correct me, that I would say we have that capacity. Like there's so much wealth in this, just in Europe alone. It's just very unequally distributed. And whether it's by, you mentioned this idea of making a one-time tax on the top 10%, there's also progressive forces that's been advocating for European wealth tax or some kinds of wealth tax. And we also have millions of euros in tax havens, and that's being money laundered. So I think there's enough money out there. We just need to find a way to get them into the public sphere as well. And I think that's important for us to say in the election campaigns.
Maybe Mr. Beck, and then last word to Guillaume on this one.
Yes, on the question on CCS, I mean, we know that the Commission will come forward with a target, climate target for 2040 next week. It's a very ambitious target, and I think we really need all technologies. I don't think we should start a discussion one technology over the other, but we need all solutions if we want to meet the ambition which was set by the Paris Agreement, and which is now also being confirmed in the EU climate targets. Of course, we need to see how we make that work. CCS is absolutely necessary. That has been said by the UN IPCC, by the IEA, and now also by the impact assessment on the climate law from the European Commission. I think it's a mistake to narrow down the market for CCS too much at the beginning. We need to give the market also some room to breathe and to develop. But of course, I mean, cement is probably the most clear-cut case where we need CCS to be implemented. And I also want to refer to what was just said, that there are resources available. I think it's absolutely necessary to streamline and align the existing funding programs at the European level. The recovery fund was mentioned. If you look at the recovery plans of the member states, decarbonization of ETS installation point sources are almost non-present. CCS is not mentioned once. If we will look at the just transition funding, also here there is no focus on ETS installation, instead of in Sweden, only in Sweden, Belgium and Croatia. And also the ETS revenues have been mentioned. These are huge resources. The cement industry will, I think, contribute, we calculated around 80 to 100 billion over the next 10, 12 years. If these revenues would be used more effectively, not maybe for debt lowering purposes, but really invested in the industry to decarbonize, I think we would make already a huge step. And there are discussions around CCFDs or competitive bidding programs, so we can also make the funding programs more effective for large-scale deployment. One last element I would like to bring in is also the question of speed. And I think really speed in the transition is a new quality of its own. 2030 is around the corner, that's 6 years from now. The technologies I'm talking about, they need 5 to 6 years to be actually implemented. And I'm not talking about the permitting, I'm not talking about the funding procedures. So we really need to find a better balance in the discussions at the European level between the search for the perfect solution and get moving with the deployment of the clean technologies we have.
Thank you. Guillaume.
Yeah, maybe just a word, and I'm going to switch to French if I'm allowed to be a bit more straight to the point. Donc sur le CCS, clairement, pour moi, c'est pas un enjeu de répartition de l'argent public, je suis d'accord avec toi. C'est plus un enjeu de... alors juste pour préciser, j'ai travaillé dans cette filière il y a 10 ans, pendant à peu près 2 ans, donc je connais assez bien le sujet. C'est pas une question de faisabilité technique, c'est pas une question même de faisabilité économique, c'est plus une question de priorisation des solutions et de mindset dans ce qu'on promeut. En fait, le risque du CCS, c'est de rester dans un statu quo. Donc, c'est nécessaire dans certains secteurs, dans l'industrie, dans certains secteurs industriels, dans le ciment par exemple, CCS, on me demande, je dis oui. CCS pour continuer à faire du charbon pour produire de l'électricité? Évidemment non. Et c'est pour ça que le CCS est promu aussi par toute l'industrie de l'oil and gas, parce que ça maintient aussi toute l'industrie fossile en place. Donc ça, dans ce cas, non. Aussi, je pense que c'est nécessaire de préciser qu'il faut faire attention à ce qu'on met derrière le net zero, pour cette très exacte raison. C'est que si c'est net zero avec 50% de CCS et de captages divers, y compris des puits naturels forestiers, qu'on mise que là-dessus et pas assez sur l'atténuation et la réduction réelle des émissions, on va juste complètement se planter. Donc attention au CCS aussi pour ça. Et dans le plan de la commission qui sort mardi à 2040, in my opinion, on mise beaucoup trop encore sur le net et pas assez sur le gross reduction.
Thank you. Jean, I just want to make it clear. Well, I'm not an economist. Well, I minored in economy, but I'm an engineer by training. And indeed, maybe engineers know the potential and the limits, the limitations of technology. And I do believe that the Greens see that technology is part of the answer, as you said. But oftentimes you hear reassuring language from politicians, mostly politicians. Yeah, don't worry, we don't need to change anything because technology will solve it. And that is indeed a fallacy. And we should neither be, how should I say, fiercely anti-technology, nor should we be daydreamers about technology. There's stuff that technology can do, and there's stuff that technology just can't do. One last question, and then I will give the floor to Alexandra Geese for the conclusion. But so one more.
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon, Bertrand Vert. There is another question in case, but I will try to be short. Just to say, being locally elected in Belgium, I have a question coming from the ground, let's say. You mentioned several times the question of public procurement, procurement, achat public. My question to you in this transition, because all these local authorities, regions, even states spending quite a lot each year in Europe, almost 15 to 18% of the GDP, 2,000 billion euro. So it's already pretty much in terms of expenditures. So it's perhaps not the question of the quantity, but perhaps the question of the quality. And I'm curious to hear Mr. Beck, for example, from this chemical sector. What is not happening in terms of quality of the expenditure? What could we improve? And you, Philippe, working at European level, it means directives on public procurement. Do you think we could do something on there? Thank you.
Well, I saw the person right behind you being so disappointed that you were the last, so you were not the last. I'll take the last one. No? Allez, quickly.
Okay. Thank you, Philippe, for this. So I'm going to try to be short. So I think we all agree that Europe needs to decarbonize itself, especially our industries. Perhaps we need to decarbonize our transport and energy sector to make it more sustainable. However, what I'm missing in the general public debate, and of course also the political one on the green and just transition in Europe, is that it is always or most of the time focused on what Europe needs to do or what should do to decarbonize itself, and often this debate lack of the comprehensive analysis perhaps on the responsibility that the EU has on the global south, for example. And perhaps if we are pushing for decarbonizing our transport sectors, for example, the question would be, for example, how this sector will be decarbonizing if we are using electric, for example, cars or bikes, where these raw materials are coming from, and who produce those, in which way they are produced. So, and I also heard from one of the speakers saying that Europe cannot pay for let's say for the global side, or at least not entirely for what is needed to make sure that we all go in the same direction when it comes to the climate. So my question, to be more short and precise, is what is needed actually to ensure that the EU debate around decarbonizing ourselves doesn't keep feeding the extractivism approach that we've been using so far, and ensuring that it takes the full picture and maybe even take its own responsibility on what we have been doing in the Global South to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. So, who of the speakers, Mr. Beck, you were questioned on public procurement. I don't know how much Heidelberg is confronted to that, because usually you sell to companies that serve the public sector, right? But maybe you have something to say about that, public procurement.
Yeah, but of course we speak with our buyers, and we speak also with the end users. So public procurement, I think, is very important. I think I mentioned that around 40% of concrete is used in public projects. And public tenders usually have the characteristics that the main criteria is the price. So we actually are very much in favor of including sustainability criteria in these tenders. There was an attempt to do that as part of the revision of the construction product regulation, but in the end, it was turned into a voluntary commitment. So I think it's very important to look at the procurement rules. The European Procurement Directive was not revised since 2014. But in addition to that, we also really need to look at building codes and standardization. Standards are absolutely key. It's a very long process to revise standards, but they are currently not fit for purpose. I mean, if you look, for example, when we talk about circularity and using more circular content in our products, currently many national building standards limit the possibility of recycled content in these materials by 30%. Even though we can already go much higher, we can already go to 50% or 60%. And we are also in favor of including the CO2 performance in standards and in procurement. But of course, that needs to be done based on a methodology which is the same for all materials going into a building.
Thank you. Kira.
Thank you. I wanted to come in on the public procurement as well, because one of the things that both the European Trade Union Confederation and also the Greens is fighting for is to have a revision of the public procurement directive in the next legislature. And I know less about the green aspects of it, but I think this is also here where it's very clear how we can link the green and the social transition. Because when we have, for example, new infrastructure projects, to make sure via the public procurement rules that it's not based on very, very bad labor conditions further down in the value chain. There's also a bit of the link to the Global South, but I leave that for Philippe as well. But to make sure that we can actually also make social conditions for these big infrastructure and energy projects, that is very crucial. And I don't know, Esther, if you want to...
No, I want to completely agree with you, and thank you for making those points. I think it's the perfect example of the green and the social, working together, making sure in public procurement rules, no matter what's being bought, in investment rules, no matter where the money is going, that we make sure to mutually reinforce, to make sure that it's quality jobs that are being created, that there's no misery, that there's no exploitation, that instead what this is about high road future for ourselves, our children, our grandchildren. And I think we couldn't get a better example of working together on it.
Thank you. Jean, you wanted to add something.
Yes, I wanted to go back to the debate over the next NGU. Because as things stand, NGU is going to drop.
That's the recovery fund.
The recovery fund. The next.
Sorry,
there's a recovery fund. The money in the recovery fund, money disbursed annually, is going to drop from above 50 billion per year to below 20 billion per year, and it's going to do that in the next 2 years. Yes. Okay. So and that's politically extremely important, because it means those who oppose the green transition will say, okay, the EU just sets the rules and set the objectives and lets the member states pay for it. So I think it's really important if some additional new borrowing scheme for the reason that Olivier gave earlier could be engineered. That would be an extremely useful addition. It's legally possible. So there is, I mean, legal scholars have studied and say it's legally possible because it's not a way to finance current expenditures. It's a way to finance a one-off, even so it's over a certain number of years, but it's a non-recurrent spending.
I just want to say on the global south, and you use the term extractivism, and I think it's totally right. Indeed, we live on a finite planet, and Guillaume said it very clearly in the presentation. It may have escaped you, but indeed, we need investment, but without sufficiency strategies, that is, strategies that tackle the demand, we won't succeed. We won't succeed. And so it's a balance. And indeed, some people like to present the transition as one big silver bullet. No, it's not one big silver bullet. It's a combination of things. It's a combination of things that will bring us home. Guillaume?
Oui, tout à fait d'accord. Toute activité a un impact, en fait. Donc, même quand on parle décarbonation, en fait, on parle que des émissions. Il faut avoir confiance qu'il y a 9 limites planétaires. Et comme dit Aurélien Barraud, par exemple, que j'aime bien citer, vous avez beau raser, si vous rasez un hectare de forêt gorgé de vie pour faire un entrepôt Amazon ou un supermarché, vous avez beau le faire avec un tractopelle, un bulldozer solaire, vous avez un impact, d'accord, sur la biodiversité, sur les ressources en général. Donc c'est pour ça qu'on parle et qu'on met au centre de ce qu'on propose la sobriété et la production, la relocalisation, la production locale. Et donc, notamment, on regarde l'impact métaux de nos scénarios et est-ce que ça passe si l'Europe récupère sa fair share des ressources en question. Et on voit que c'est compliqué en fait sur certains métaux. Il faut sans sobriété, donc tous les scénarios technoscientistes, ils sont dans les choux complètement là-dessus. Le nôtre passe ric-rac. Et déjà, il y a beaucoup de sufficiency dedans. Et tertio, si on veut se procurer ces ressources en question, alors il faut faire tout ce qu'on peut chez nous, mais si on doit acheter à l'extérieur, le but, c'est évidemment pas de déporter encore notre pollution et d'acheter au moins 10 ans juste par les prix avec des conditions sociales et environnementales déplorables. Et donc là, on revient aussi sur la question du procurement et de notre responsabilité en tant qu'acheteur.
Merci, merci. Now comes the moment of the conclusion. We started late, so we are going to finish late, but no later than we started. So we have been keeping our allocated time. And Alexandra, please come on stage. Alexandra Geese is a first-term Green member of the European Parliament. She's from North Rhine-Westphalia, the most industrialized part of Germany, the biggest region of Germany, population-wise. 18 million, is that right? 18 million out of 80. And that's a place where transitioning heavy industry means a lot, right? Really a lot. But you're also German. We mentioned these things about Schuldenbremse, Schwarze Null, and all these crazy ideological things. Tell us, what's your perspective? Because, well, contrary to me, you will be fighting the next European election campaign. I may just help a bit. How do you see all that we exchanged today and bringing it to the campaign? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Philippe, and good to see you all to discuss a super important topic. I think it's very difficult to do really short conclusions on everything that has been said from such a rich discussion, so I decided to pick up just a few points from the speakers and make some personal notes and questions about them. I think investment as an act of faith, that's a really great, beautiful image. We believe in our futures, but we have to convince others that we are not crazy and religious, that it's not only about faith, but that it's doable. And this is why I loved Guillaume Kerlero's presentation, because it's not for dreamers, but for doers. He gave us the real numbers we can use to make our point. 360 billion a year, that's a lot. But it's something I can imagine. It's something we can relate to other expenditure that we have been making, and he has shown that very clearly, that we have managed to overcome certain economic crises, spending a lot more money. So it's absolutely doable, and I think that's the first message, that's for me the first takeaway that we should take into the campaign. Winston Beck, well, I didn't know that concrete was the second most used material after water. That is a very interesting takeaway. No idea how I'm going to use that in the campaign, but still good to know. But the clear point that he was making, and that the Greens with Philippe and in the lead have been making, we do need investment. We absolutely do need investment. We need a lot of private investment. We do need public investment. And that is a common task for our society. We can't just leave the industry alone with it. At the same time, I think that debate with Winston has shown that we don't have a clear agreement yet what this kind of investment should be spent for. In this case, we had a lengthy discussion, always happens with the Greens, on how important CCS, what the role of CCS can be, but there are certainly many other aspects when we go down to the details. Esther Lynch, we said it's not, the time's over where you have to choose between a job or green policy. I think we are even further than that. Without a green economy, you might not have a job anymore in the future, because we have a subsidies race in the world, China and the US in different ways investing very heavily on the green transition, and if we don't do it, we might still have a green industry, but it might not be in Europe anymore. And as Philippe said, I'm from North Rhine-Westphalia, I care about having an industry, and this is what the Greens want. They want to keep the industry in Europe, and they want to have clean steel and clean concrete here in Europe. How do we do that? Esther was the first one to bring in the economic governance rules, who are really, really a big obstacle, and we have been discussing this also with the German trade unions and how to overcome this. Philippe has done this, leading the work. I heard Olivier, who sort of said, well, this is sort of set in stone. I think there's still margin politically, maybe not in this moment, but in a year or two, so we have to keep focusing on the topic, and thanks for bringing that up and doing that. But I think what was even more important was about the fairness and the equity of the transition. You know, although everybody's saying nobody should be left behind, people are being behind. Workers are being left behind in industries that are difficult to transform. People are being left behind just because of the cost of living crisis in this moment. And if I may make a point where I have worked on that has not been made today, women are being left behind. Next Generation EU has been mentioned quite a lot of times. And that is investment, and we have done the studies where normally 80%, in the very best case, which is Spain, on a very long term with a lot of preconditions, 60% are going to male-dominated sectors. Male jobs, male salaries. So in the best case, women get 40%. That is pretty far from the 50. In reality, it's closer to 80. And this is something that we are not discussing when we discuss about new forms of New Generation EU, new funds. They have also to be gender equal. Because putting this kind of money, with 360 billion in Europe per year, into a few industries, like renewable energy, like heavy industry, like transport. Those are all industries where very few women work. We have heard nothing about care, for example, today, and this will increase the salaries in those sectors, because these sectors will need talent, and we need a lot of people, and these people will be well paid, and the gender pay gap will increase. So when we talk about equity and fairness of the transition, we really need to consider the gender aspect. Thank you. Jean Pisani-Ferry, I really love the "It's Getting Real" the Greens have been saying that. I've been campaigning 2019, and it sounded sort of when we were saying these things like, well, this is really far away and it's really for dreamers, and now we're in the middle of it. We already have the new climate legislation, we have done the Green Deal, so it's getting realer and realer. It is real, actually. So good to hear that from you. As a message, a takeaway for us campaigning, I would like to translate what you said about high capex, translating then into lower operational expenditure. It means if you invest now, you benefit later. It's going to be cheaper later, but you have to invest now, for the non-economists in the room. And one point that I really wanted to focus on, you talked about the 3 ways to get there, and the first one was reshuffling, and the third one was taxes. And you correctly mentioned the resistance. And this is really what we are experiencing right now. I think you mentioned the farmers resisting the reshuffling. In Germany, we had some experience with the law on buildings and heating. The Germans in the room will remember, and some other people as well. So the resistance we are encountering is fierce, because it's very difficult to tackle all aspects at the same time. And so you have to pick out, one sector, one group of people, of population, one part of society that is going to pay a price first. And in order to convince people to stay on board, we need to do different things, but what the Greens need is, don't leave us alone. We need the economists. It's not only up to the Greens to keep making the point. We need people who have credibility with other sectors of society. So we need you as economists. We need the industry. And in Germany, 50 big companies have actually written a letter to the government and the opposition about the debt and the debt break, what we call it. I come back to Germany later, since I was asked the question. And we need the employers, we need the trade unions, and we really need to make that point together, with maybe different visions of how exactly to spell it out, but we need to show it's not just the green point, like tackling the climate crisis is not just a green policy point. It's something that concerns us all, and I hope we're in this together, and I really appreciate you being here, but we need to keep that up and being in some kind of alliance or quiet, saying different things, but going in the same direction to really explain what it's about. Olivier, Blanchard, I don't know if the non-economists in the room appreciated that lesson in algebra of macroeconomics. I did. I thought it was super interesting. For those who didn't really get it, it was basically we need 0.5 more investment in terms of debt ratio to GDP. I did say that correctly, but almost. We need more investment because, on a debt planet, there's no point in having a 60% debt GDP ratio. And the question I asked myself, this hasn't come really up, do you economists use also the scenarios that consider the cost of the climate crisis? Because now what we are comparing, what you are comparing is the current scenario, what we are doing now, compared to what we could be doing to counter the climate crisis and to do the necessary investment. But I think what governments and the European Commission should be looking at is the budget we need if we fight the climate crisis, and the budget we are going to have in the next years, because you said we have to look at the evolution of that if the climate crisis is getting worse and worse. And I come from a country where close to my place, there is a very small area that was hit by a flood. And the government has earmarked 30 billion, and that's a really small region. It's 5 or 6 villages. If you need 30 billion for such a small area, what do you do if the climate crisis gets worse and worse? And we know for certain that extreme weather conditions and extreme weather events are more and more. So I think what we should be comparing is not the status quo, but it's how much money do we need to fight the climate crisis and how much money will we need to support and endure the climate crisis. That's the interesting question I would like economists to ask and to say. So I'm losing my notes. Kira, you mentioned social dialogue and the role of banks on top of all the other things, and then the fact that even Denmark can invest into energy efficiency because of the rules. Well, Germany, we have rules that are even worse than that. We have something called a debt brake, which doesn't allow us right now to really face the climate crisis. It's a really serious problem because in order to overcome it, you need a 2/3 majority in parliament. That means to need the opposition on board. So there was a question on how is the discussion going? Well, there are a lot of green voices that are saying we can't work with this instrument, we need to do something about it, we need to find a way to invest on top, or we need to suspend the debt brake, saying, well, the climate crisis is very important to counter, so we need to suspend it. But I don't see in the political area currently a majority for that, because liberals and conservatives are against, social democrats are sort of split. And the problem, I think, is something that I think Philippe mentioned. This is not about facts. This is about ideology, and it's about emotions. And as Philippe said, in German, debt means should, so what's it in English? Guilt. In Germany, when you have debt, you feel guilty. And so it's a really emotional thing, and it's a really ideological thing we need to overcome. And this is, again, where we need this broad alliance of economists, also conservative economists. We need the entrepreneurs on board, we need companies on board, we need the trade unions on board to make a collective effort to understand that investing and countering the climate crisis is not something you need to feel guilty about, but rather the contrary is you need to feel guilty about not doing it. So really hoping for your help here. So I think thank you. We have a lot of reasons to fight for more investment, and we're doing it. And I just want to add one last one. In the light of what is happening right now, we have seen a surge of the far right. I hope in Germany now the millions of people out in the streets have been out in the street in the past 2 weeks are stopping this. But the lack of investment causes an economic disruption. I mentioned the subsidy race, the US and China, and if we don't invest, our industry will be lagging behind, and that might cause serious economic crisis or disruptions. And there is a clear link between a good economy, a fair economy that takes everybody on board, and the trust people have in their governments and in democracy. And that link is extremely important, especially right now. I have had, I wouldn't say the pleasure, but I've been reading some strategists from the far-right movement, and what they are hoping for is a worsening of the economic situation. They're hoping for a great crisis. They are super happy about the cost of living crisis right now, because this makes people have doubts. It makes people feel excluded. It makes people lose faith in democracy and in their governments. And this is also why it is so important, not only for climate reasons, that we have that investment in order to keep our economy alive in Europe, but also in order to have a fair transition. People need to have the feeling to be part of a community, to be taken on board, not to be left behind. You know, everybody, I think, is ready to do their share. They just need to have the feeling that everybody else is doing it as well. It's not about giving up something, because they know they're getting something else. It's about having the feeling we are all in this together. And this is, I think, what is lacking right now. I can certainly speak for Germany, but I think this is all over Europe. So we need to be in this together. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, and somebody mentioned is about having a vision. You know, people are ready to give up something, or to have the courage to go for a transformation, to change. But they need to have a feeling this community, this government knows where it's going. We have a common vision. This is shared by people, and everybody thinks this is a good idea, and it's clearly said what we want to do. And this is the lack, somebody said that, it's a lack of vision we have in Europe. And the feeling that the government is proactively addressing the crisis, that makes people feel better. And then you have a feeling it's not a crisis, it's a transformation, and I have hope for the future. You said investment as an act of faith. So it's about believing in the future. And right now, our governments are not making people believe in their futures because they don't really know where they're going. I don't want us to make the same mistake that we have done in digital. My policy area is digital, where Europe has lots of talent, lots of technologies. There we don't have the companies. Here in our industry, we have the big companies, we have the talent, we have the technologies, we have the companies. We need the capital. We can get that capital. We do have that capital if you want to. We just need the vision. So let's have faith. And who is better placed than the Greens? We envisage a Europe as a community where people care for each other. We do have a vision. It's not only climate neutrality, it's a democratic, peaceful Europe with a green economy. We have that vision, we believe in it, we have faith. Let's be optimistic, just let's do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you to all our speakers who took the time to speak about the economy on a Saturday evening, and thanks to all of you for your participation. I hope that you all come back a bit wiser and a bit more energized home. Thank you.